We should be done by 7:45 or 8, I think, right?
Yep, I think so.
Yeah, good.
I think I'll also just continue the intros. That way, I think the session will also be shorter. So, what
Okay.
I perfect. So, Karthik, I think I can see the stream. If it's all good at your end, I'll click start. Fantastic. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Abhishek, and I'm pleased to invite you all to KYE's series on how to crack the AOR exam. In today's session, we will be focusing on cracking the second paper, which is on drafting. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Shia Meni, an awardee of the prestigious Salve Scholarship in 2014, who graduated from GNLU in 2013. She secured her BCL from the University of Oxford in 2015 and is currently working as an advocate of record at the Supreme Court of India and also a visiting faculty at Ragnur Patiala and an adjunct faculty at Lloyd Law College, Noida. In this session, she will be speaking in detail on how to prepare and crack the second paper of the AOR exam. I would now like to hand it over to ma'am to begin the session.
Thank you so much. I think one of the most interesting aspects about the AOR examination is that the second paper deals with an extremely practical and extremely conceptual touch, which we utilize when we actually practice. And I think this makes the paper even more interesting, which is titled Drafting and Pleading. So the Supreme Court's second paper of the AOR examination series deals with drafts, creation of these drafts, and essentially to decipher what draft to file, what draft to actually pen down in the examination paper. And that's where drafting becomes one of the most tricky and one of the most tough and competitive papers when it comes to cracking the AOR examination. So the first tip, which I can essentially give all of you, is that there is a half an hour extra when it comes to writing the drafting paper, the second paper of the AOR examination series, where we get 3 hours to solve a 100-mark paper. This is an examination where we get 3.5 hours to actually be with the question paper. The half an hour, the first half an hour, which is essentially extra, is given to us with a pen or a pencil to be handed over, of course, to us by the examinee halls. And this is what you have to remember. You cannot carry your own stationery except to the extent of pencils. So one of the first tips that we always give for drafting papers is please carry sharpened pencils. The only pens that you can actually use for the drafting exam is supplied by the examiners themselves. So for sharpened pencils, be the first tip when it comes to solving the drafting paper of the AOR examination series. So this is where you are one-to-one with the examination paper for about half an hour. And you can actually make those little notes by the side to decipher what jurisdictional exercise to actually do when it comes to writing those drafts. What do I mean by this? Let me explain. So when we study Supreme Court practice and procedure, in the first series, when we discussed paper 1, if you look at that paper explanation, I'd mentioned very categorically in this series itself that you have certain jurisdictional molds when it comes to Supreme Court practice and procedure. These jurisdictional molds are different types of jurisdictions: writs, appeals, special leave to appeals, original petitions, original suits. These are different. Contempt petitions, arbitral appointment petitions. These are different petitions that we file before the Supreme Court of India under different jurisdictional molds, different jurisdictional articles of the Indian Constitution, which bestows these jurisdictions on the Supreme Court of India. So the drafting paper is not only just an exercise where we cull out the law and actually break down the law to make the grounds, etc., for a draft, but we also decipher which petition to file for which answer. So if there is a paper which is, you have to decipher what to file. So for instance, if there is a question in the drafting paper which deals with conviction, which deals with filing an appeal thereafter, that means we are in the realm of filing criminal appeals, unlike an interlocutory order or an interim order, where we may have to file a special leave to appeal during the anvil of trial to impugn a particular order. Now, what do I mean by this? The simplest way to understand this is that tip number 2, which is that the drafting paper runs into 10 to 12 pages. So when I say that you read the question paper for that long, you also make notes for what to file. Tip number 2 means that you actually figure out the jurisdictional mold, and in your mind, you have jotted down the format for that jurisdictional mold. So the best way to crack the AOR examination drafting paper is to curate and create in your own notes prior to the exam drafts for all of these jurisdictions. So you should have a draft ready for a civil appeal. You should have a draft format ready for a criminal appeal. You should have a draft format ready for a special leave petition. And most of these drafts you are going to find as forms, as standard formats behind the Supreme Court Rules 2013. So tip number 3 is download all of these formats when it comes to the drafting paper. So you're going to find, say, a form number 28 when it comes to SLP filing. Quickly go to form 28, download form 28, and you have to memorize this draft. There's no other way. There are declarations you have to memorize. There are contents you have to memorize. Now, tip number 4, an extremely useful tip, which I always give students, is this, that one of the easiest way to formulating grounds is this. Every particular petition before the Supreme Court, because it's a court of law, all the content is, it's a court of record, it's a court of law, all the content is archived for posterity. You're almost going to have, for instance, a writ petition. It's always going to have a ground which says this particular act is challenged because it definitely violates the constitutional validity, the wires of Article 14, Article 21, the Golden Triangle, Article 19, perhaps of the Indian Constitution. So if it's a writ, there's essentially a fundamental right challenge. So that's always going to be 2 to 3 grounds made already set for you. Secondly, Wednesbury principle, arbitrariness. All of these are basic grounds which you can find, which are across the board present in all writ petitions. Certain grounds in all bail SLP filings, that, okay, he's the sole breadwinner of the family, the person's been inside judicial custody for X number of days, custody cannot be a replacement for conviction. All of these are basic grounds for a bail SLP, for a civil appeal, for, say, a contempt. All of these writs, you'll find these easily when you look at multiple drafts. So the 4th or the 5th tip is this. Look at those formats and see what of the formats at the max you can cull out. So if you can cull out a prayer, you can cull out an interim prayer and certain grounds as a staple format, do that. Tip number 5, prior subject knowledge. This is extremely useful, everyone, for cracking the AOR examination paper number 2, drafting and pleading. Why do I say this? I say this because it is after 5 years of practice that you get an opportunity to write the drafting pleading paper. So I think it's very important that prior subject knowledge is taken care of. And this is where you have to have a basic knowledge of about how CPC works, the Civil Procedure Code, how CRPC works, the Criminal Procedure Code. How do these topics actually run out and play in practice? Because remember, you're coming up from trial to the Supreme Court. So you're looking at an appeal bottom through the anvil of trial up unto the first appeal stage. You're in the second appeal stage and you're expected to know what could the law have been. So some grounds could also come from points of law. This is what you can jot down by the side with your pencils in that little half an hour which you get at the beginning. The 6th tip, which comes for drafting paper, is remember this: the format has marks. So don't leave any question unanswered. Even if you're not able to figure out in those 3 hours if I have to file a special leave to appeal or a statutory appeal, please at least write out the common format for appeals. That's going to fetch you marks because you get essentially 5 questions, 20 marks each, and 100 marks drafting paper. And there's galore, options galore. So you're going to find options for criminal filing, for civil drafting. You're going to find all of these options. So ensure that if the interest is arbitration, if the interest is civil, recovery matters, transaction, commercial litigation, then you prepare these drafts supremely well and do 2 or 3 criminal side drafts as well. The last and final tip, which I think is extremely useful, which I'd like to end by, is this. Check your examiner who's actually making the drafting paper that year. Like I said, there are examiners' lectures, AOR examiners lectures, which are convened 2 to 3 weeks before the exams every time. And these are held in the Supreme Court chambers itself. The courtroom converts to a classroom. So check who is your examiner. If you have a senior advocate who has a thriving criminal law practice, expect questions from criminal law. Even in your drafting paper, you could have a criminal appeal, a bail. I was very lucky. I'm someone who enjoys criminal law, and I had criminal law sprinkled all through my examination paper when it came to drafting. Also, the last and final tip, I know this was the penultimate one, the last and final tip would be prepare the basic jurisdictions well and go. So Supreme Court practice and procedure, if you prepare the jurisdictions well, you're almost okay. So with that, I'm going to end. This is what I can tell you about the drafting paper. Of course, it's a paper which you have to experience because it's extremely practical. If you've shadowed under an AOR, you're going to find it extremely useful and easy. And this is going to make the drafting paper much easier. So 2 tips: study paper 2 only after you finish preparation for paper 1. Never jump the gun. And second tip, paper 1 prepared would essentially mean paper 2 half baked and half done. Over to you, team.
Thank you so much for that, ma'am. I think those were, again, very detailed insights on how one can start preparing for the second paper.
Abhishek,
yeah.
Sorry. Did I cut you?
No worries at all.
No, you finish and then I'd probably just pitch in. I had something more to pitch in, but I think you can fit in, and then I will.
For sure. So we do also hope to invite you for paper 3 and paper 4. But yes, back to you, ma'am.
So all I was mentioning was, please also ensure that when you write your drafting papers, your handwritings are legible, they're clean, they're sorted. So this is one tip which I'd forgotten, which I think is very basic, but we need to put it out there. So just ensure you're writing with a paper, a pen, which is extremely clean, legible, and the handwriting is good. That's all.
Thank you once again for joining us today, ma'am. Karthikeya.